The first time I knew something was truly wrong, I found a wine glass, lipstick stained red, not my shade, sitting in the kitchen sink. It was a Thursday. Late. I'd gotten home after visiting my sister in Denver for a few days. Mark was supposed to pick me up from the airport, but last minute he texted saying he had a work thing, and that I should just take a car. That was already odd. He was never good at hiding guilt, too smooth, too eager to play casual. When I stepped into our house, it smelled different. Someone had sprayed something sweet, vanilla or artificial roses, to mask the faint scent of perfume. The kind that clung to upholstery. That clashed with the usual clean cedar scent of our hallway diffuser. At first I stood quietly in the foyer, luggage in hand, just listening. The kind of silence that felt too still. Then I walked toward the kitchen. That's where I found it. One wine glass in the sink. Half rinsed. Lipstick on the rim. Scarlet. I don't wear lipstick like that. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I just stood there looking at that glass, letting the weight of what it meant sink in. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This wasn't late nights at the office or new cologne or mood swings. This was evidence. Mark had brought someone here. Into our house. The one we bought together, the one I furnished, the one I painted and filled with photos of our vacations, our holidays, our early hopeful years. And whoever she was, she'd been comfortable enough to drink wine in my kitchen. That night I didn't say a word. I showered, unpacked, slid into bed next to him while he pretended to be asleep. His breathing was too steady, too rehearsed. The next morning I made breakfast like always. Toast. Eggs. Coffee. He walked in with a tired smile, kissed my cheek like nothing had happened, and asked how my trip was. I lied. I smiled. I asked about work. I pretended not to notice the faint scent of someone else's shampoo on his hoodie. I needed time. Space. Because I wasn't going to confront him until I had something stronger than a wine glass. Until I was ready to take everything back. And that was the moment I stopped being a wife and started becoming something else. Something he never expected. For the next 2 weeks I lived like a stranger in my own home. Mark kept up appearances. Making coffee in the mornings, casually scrolling through his phone at dinner, initiating half-hearted conversations about the news or work. But everything about him was slightly off. His smiles were a little too quick. His answers a little too vague. He was trying too hard to act normal. I didn't press. I didn't accuse. I became quieter, more observant. I started taking mental notes of every detail like I was building a case in my head, because I was. He started working later than usual, almost every night. Texting more. Laughing at things I couldn't see. Sometimes he'd go into another room to take calls, shutting the door behind him like I wasn't even there. He was sloppy. Lazy even. That was the part that surprised me. Mark had always been calculated, never impulsive. But now, he didn't even try to hide it anymore. One afternoon I came home from work earlier than expected and found 2 wine glasses drying on the counter. 2 plates in the sink. His blazer draped over a chair that had once been part of our wedding registry. I checked the garbage. Takeout containers. Italian. Still warm. I walked into the bedroom. The bed was made, but only just. There was a long blonde hair curled near my pillow. I have dark hair. I didn't clean it up. I didn't touch a thing. I took photos. Quietly. Discreetly. Every time I found something, another wine glass, a smudged mirror, a bathroom drawer I hadn't opened but now held a toothbrush that wasn't mine, I documented it. I also called a lawyer. Her name was Denise Tran. Recommended by a friend who had gone through a brutal divorce last year. When we met, I didn't tell her everything. Not at first. Just enough for her to nod slowly and say, "You'll need evidence. Clear ownership lines. And patience." That night I pulled out our mortgage documents. My name. Sole owner. I remembered the day we closed. Mark's credit was in ruins at the time, and I had used part of my inheritance as the down payment. We signed a quitclaim deed and he had agreed, verbally and in writing, that the house would be under my name until things got stable. He never cared to revisit it. Until now he probably assumed we were still equals in that house. But legally I owned every square inch of it. Denise's voice echoed in my head. Let them get comfortable. Let them feel like they've won. So I did. I let him think I was clueless. I let him think the act was working. I let him keep his secret while I quietly built my own. Then one Saturday morning everything changed. I had gone to yoga. When I came home, the garage door was open. A second car, an unfamiliar pearl-white SUV, was parked in my spot. I stepped into the house and heard laughter from upstairs. Feminine. Light. Casual. I stood at the foot of the staircase, staring up, knowing exactly what I'd find. He didn't even wait for me to leave town this time. He moved her in. Just like that. As if I didn't exist. As if this house, my house, was theirs now. I walked back out the front door. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I called Denise. "It's time," I said. "Let's take the house back." I didn't return to the house that night. Instead, I checked into a quiet hotel on the other side of the city. Nothing extravagant, just a clean room with blackout curtains and enough distance from the place I no longer recognized. The woman at the front desk asked if I was checking in for business or pleasure. I smiled politely and said, "Neither." Alone in that room, I opened my laptop and got to work. I forwarded everything to Denise. The photos, the mortgage documents, the old emails, even a copy of the quitclaim deed Mark had signed nearly a decade ago. She responded within an hour, short and precise. "Everything checks out. He has no legal claim to the house. We'll proceed with an exclusive occupancy motion." I stared at those words, heart pounding in a way that wasn't fear. It was something more focused, more dangerous. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was reclaiming what was mine. The next step was to gather documentation of the unauthorized occupation. Denise explained that while Mark technically still had marital status, Camille had none. She wasn't a tenant. She wasn't a spouse. She had no legal grounds to be in the property. And if we could show that Mark had willfully excluded me from my own home, changing locks, removing personal items, allowing a third party to move in, that would strengthen our case. I didn't need to break in to prove it, because I had access to everything. 2 years ago, I'd set up smart home devices for the house. Motion-activated cameras, digital locks, energy-saving systems. I still had admin access. Mark never thought to change the credentials. From my laptop, I watched as Camille danced through my living room late at night, barefoot, wearing one of Mark's t-shirts. I watched her film some video on her phone in my kitchen, rearranging the dishes, pushing aside the antique canisters that had belonged to my grandmother. I watched as Mark kissed her, lazily, distracted, while she talked about a brand collaboration. They thought they were safe behind closed doors. But the house was still mine. I took screenshots, time stamps, video clips. Every digital imprint they left behind became part of a file. Dozens of pages carefully labeled and organized. When Denise saw the footage, she simply said, "This will be more than enough." We filed the petition. Exclusive use and occupancy. A formal legal request for the court to acknowledge that I was the sole rightful resident and that Mark had unlawfully denied me access to my own property. I signed the paperwork with steady hands. Then I sat back in the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling, letting the silence settle in. I wasn't angry. I was clear. This wasn't about Mark anymore. Or Camille. This wasn't about broken vows or stolen moments. This was about identity. Boundaries. They moved her into my home thinking I would break. But I wasn't broken. I was just getting started. The court processed our petition faster than I expected. Denise called me one morning while I was sitting in the hotel cafe, nursing my second cup of coffee. Her tone was calm, but I could hear the satisfaction in it. "We got the hearing," she said. 2 weeks from today. That's when everything changes." The next 2 weeks were a waiting game. I kept my distance. Didn't go near the house. Didn't call Mark. Didn't reply to his lazy occasional text messages asking where I was or when I was coming home. There was no confrontation, no fireworks. Just silence. I knew he didn't suspect anything. That was the beauty of it. He believed I was retreating, licking my wounds, maybe even giving up. That was his mistake. He thought I was still the woman who would shrink in the face of betrayal. The one who would beg for answers. For apologies. For scraps of dignity. Instead, I was planning his exit. I spent those days preparing. Denise and I went through every document line by line. Mortgage statements, title records, even receipts for repairs and upgrades I had paid for on my own over the years. We built a timeline. A story. A fortress of proof. Meanwhile, Lila, my closest friend and neighbor, became my quiet eyes on the ground. "He's gotten comfortable," she said one night over the phone. "She parks in your spot now. They sit on your porch every evening like it's some kind of summer vacation. I didn't reply right away. I didn't need to. Because comfort breeds carelessness. And carelessness was all I needed. On the 8th day before the hearing, Mark finally called. Not a text. A full call. I let it ring until voicemail. Then he called again. I answered. His voice was light, almost amused. Hey. You've been quiet. I've been thinking, I said. About what? About what I'm going to do with the house, I answered. There was a pause. I could hear him shift, trying to read my tone. What do you mean? I mean, once you're gone, I might want to renovate. You two really messed it up. He laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. Are you serious? As a heart attack. Then I hung up. I didn't need to say more. That call was for one reason. To let him feel the ground starting to crack beneath him. The day of the hearing arrived under gray skies. A soft drizzle fell on the courthouse steps as I walked inside, dressed in a simple black suit, hair pulled back, no jewelry except my wedding ring, which I still wore not as a sign of loyalty but as evidence. I hadn't abandoned anything. He had. Mark arrived late. No Camille in sight. His hair was slightly messy, shirt wrinkled, eyes darting. Denise and I didn't even look at him. The hearing was short and factual. Denise laid out the ownership history. The financing. The quitclaim deed. The fact that I had not only paid for the house, but had been locked out of it without permission. She played security footage. Showed digital records. Presented invoices. Emails. Timestamped smart home data. Mark's lawyer looked like he wanted to melt through the floor. Mark tried to speak once. Tried to claim I had abandoned the property. Denise cut in smoothly. She didn't abandon it. She was illegally pushed out of it. The judge didn't need long. He ruled in our favor. I was granted exclusive occupancy of the property. Mark and Camille were given 30 days to vacate. If they failed to comply, law enforcement would assist in removal. No extensions. No appeals. It was over. I didn't look at him as we left the courtroom. But I heard him. He muttered something, my name, maybe a curse, maybe a plea. It didn't matter. Because at that point I wasn't angry. I wasn't even satisfied. I was free. And they were out of time. I didn't go to the house the day Mark and Camille moved out. I thought about it. I imagined myself standing on the driveway, arms crossed, watching as they carried out their belongings in shame. But I didn't need to see it to know what it looked like. I already knew what it felt like, to be dismissed, betrayed, treated as disposable. I didn't need to witness them crumbling to believe it was happening. Instead, I waited for the confirmation text from the deputy who had been assigned to supervise the move-out. Property vacated. Keys recovered. Locks changed. All clear. That was all I needed. I waited another 2 days before returning. Not out of hesitation but out of control. I wanted to walk into that house when the air had settled, when the smell of her perfume had faded, when the noise of their lives had truly gone. When I pulled into the driveway, it didn't feel like home. Not yet. The lawn was overgrown, the flowers I had planted in spring were dead, and Camille's SUV-shaped oil stains were still visible on the concrete. But the structure was mine. That part never changed. I stood at the front door for a long time before unlocking it. The house was quiet. Still. Like it had been holding its breath for weeks. Furniture was rearranged. The walls bore the faint marks of things removed too hastily. The living room rug was missing. So was the lamp from the den. In the kitchen, the plates had been changed out. Cheap replacements now sat on the rack where my grandmother's china used to be. It wasn't the same. But I wasn't the same either. I walked through the house slowly, noting everything they had taken, everything they had broken or replaced. I took inventory like it was an archaeological dig. Not of what had been stolen but of what had survived. My office was untouched. They hadn't gone through the drawers, hadn't touched the bookshelf. I closed the door gently behind me. In the bedroom, the bedding was different. Camille's style. Oversaturated colors. Pillows that didn't match. But when I pulled back the comforter, I saw it. My old monogrammed blanket still underneath, tucked to the bottom of the bed. She had tried to layer over me. But she never removed me. I stood there staring at that blanket and something unexpected washed over me. Not anger. Not sadness. Relief. Because it was mine. This place. Every corner of it. They had occupied it but they had never belonged to it. And now I could begin again. The next morning I called in a cleaning crew. Then I contacted a locksmith. Again. I replaced every lock, every code, every digital access point. Camille had filmed content in this house. Photos, videos, stories. Fragments of my life used as a backdrop to her fantasy. I scrubbed it all out. Digitally. Physically. Emotionally. I boxed up anything that had their fingerprints on it and dropped it off at a donation center. Whatever was left, I burned in the fire pit in the backyard that weekend. I watched Camille's scented candles and faux crystal vases turn to ash. I watched the flame flicker in the reflection of the windows they used to stand in front of. And for the first time in months I slept through the night. No waking up with questions. No staring at the ceiling wondering how it all fell apart. Because I wasn't rebuilding from scratch. I was rebuilding from truth. And truth was the only foundation that never cracks. The following weeks were quiet. Not the kind of silence that used to hang between Mark and me. Tense, heavy, full of things unsaid. This was clean silence. Calming. Like the house was exhaling for the first time in months. Every day I reclaimed a little more of the space. Not just with furniture or paint but with presence. I rearranged the living room back to how I liked it, so the morning sun hit the reading chair just right. I took down the cheap art Camille had nailed to the hallway and replaced it with framed photographs of places I had actually been. Some things were gone for good. My wedding china had vanished. So had the antique jewelry box my mother gave me when I turned 25. I filed a police report, though I knew nothing would come of it. I didn't need restitution. I had the house. That was enough. Mark tried to reach out twice. The first time was a short text. I know you probably hate me. I didn't handle things right. I'm sorry. I didn't respond. The second was a voicemail. His voice sounded tired. Deflated. The arrogance I'd known so well was gone, replaced by something duller. Camille left. She moved back to the city. I guess it was never real, huh? Anyway. I hope you're okay. I miss the house. That line made me pause. I miss the house. Not I miss you. Not I regret what I did. Not I wish I could take it back. He missed the thing he had tried to steal. The comfort, the ownership, the illusion of control. That was all it had ever been to him. A prize. A stage for his ego. He never really saw the work it took to build it. The years of planning. The late nights painting the nursery we never used. The fights we navigated and the dinners I cooked and the mortgage I paid when he was between jobs. He missed the shell. But he never earned the foundation. And that was the difference between us. A week later I received a letter from his lawyer. It was framed as a request for negotiation. Mark wanted to be compensated for some of the upgrades Camille had made to the house. Cosmetic renovations he claimed that added value. He included a list. Curtain rods, a rug, a mirror from a boutique, 3 plants. It was laughable. I sent everything to Denise. She responded with a formal letter declining the request and, in return, attached an invoice for damage repairs and the value of the property removed from the home without my consent. My total came out higher. We didn't hear from him again after that. In his mind he'd lost. He hadn't just lost me, he'd lost control. He'd lost the life he thought he was upgrading when he threw it away for someone younger, flashier, more exciting. Camille was gone. His apartment, from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, was small and uninspired. No backyard. No porch swing. No sun-drenched kitchen. Just walls. That's what happens when you mistake a person's life for a prop in your own. You're left with nothing when the illusion breaks. But me. I was still standing. In the house I built. In the silence I owned. In a version of my life that no longer included betrayal, performance, or pretending. Just truth. And peace. A month passed and the house began to feel like home again. It wasn't that the absence of Mark or Camille made it any easier. It was that I had slowly, methodically begun to fill the spaces with me. I no longer looked at the house through the lens of what was stolen, what was broken. I didn't see their memories scattered across the furniture. I didn't hear their voices in the walls. I heard mine. The days were quiet but not empty. I picked up old hobbies I hadn't had time for. Gardening in the small backyard, reading books I'd left half-finished, visiting friends who had drifted away during my marriage. My stepkids came by often, and although there was some awkwardness at first, we found our rhythm. They didn't ask about Mark or Camille. They simply wanted to feel welcome again. And so did I. I started to feel strong in a way I hadn't realized was possible. Stronger than I had been when I first moved into this house, full of hope and naivety. Stronger than I had been in the marriage that turned toxic, quieter by the day. I was no longer broken or weak, waiting for him to come back and apologize. No longer wondering what we could have done differently. I was done asking. Then came the call I had been waiting for but not quite ready for. It was from Denise. "Olivia," she said, her voice low but firm, "the divorce paperwork is ready." I stood still, leaning against the kitchen counter. The house was quiet, but now it felt different. For the first time in months, it felt real. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked. "I know it's a lot to take in." I exhaled. "It's the only thing left to do." We had been working on the paperwork in the background for weeks. Denise had advised me not to rush, to make sure I had everything in place first. There was the house, of course, but there were other assets. Mark's retirement accounts, a business venture he'd been secretly investing in. I had been patient, letting him hang himself with his own lies and decisions. And now it was time to make sure the divorce went as smoothly as possible. "You're ready," she said. "I'll file the papers tomorrow morning." We agreed on one final meeting to sign everything. The paperwork was thorough. It spelled out what would happen to everything we had built together. I didn't want his apologies. I didn't want to hear him beg. I didn't need an explanation. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about me reclaiming what was mine and putting an end to what he had tried to destroy. The next morning I signed the divorce papers. But that wasn't the end. 2 weeks after that, the first sign of retaliation came. I was sitting in my office when I received an email. It was from Mark's lawyer. He wanted to contest the terms of the settlement. He claimed that the assets divided weren't fairly valued. He tried to argue that I was taking advantage of the situation. I didn't flinch. I forwarded it to Denise. She read it, sighed, and said, "We'll file a motion to dismiss this. You'll be fine." I didn't expect anything different from Mark. He had always been a man who couldn't accept loss, especially when it was someone else's gain. But I wasn't surprised by his childish attempt to claw back control. He didn't understand that it wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about the house or the money or the life we had. It was about peace. It was about letting go. A week later I heard from him again, but this time it was different. I was sitting on the porch, sipping tea, when I saw a familiar figure walk up the driveway. Mark. He was standing at the end of the sidewalk, looking at me like he wasn't sure whether to approach. I took a deep breath, set my cup down, and walked out to meet him. "You look different," he said, his voice soft, guarded. His eyes moved over the house, then back to me. "I'm not who I was," I said simply. "I've changed. I can see that." He ran a hand through his hair. "Olivia, I'm sorry. I was stupid. I don't know what came over me." I crossed my arms, waiting. "I messed up," he continued, his voice tight. "I've been seeing things differently now. I realized I was wrong. You were right all along." I didn't respond immediately. Instead I studied him. The man who had once promised me everything. Who had betrayed me, broken my trust, and then tried to replace me with someone else. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. "I'm not angry, Mark," I said finally. "I'm just done." He looked at me as if waiting for me to soften, for some sign that I might still care. But I stood firm. "I don't want your apologies," I added quietly. "What happened is over. And it's done. I'm not the person I was when you left me here." He didn't say anything for a long moment, then his eyes softened. "So what now?" "Now," I said, straightening up. "You move on. And so do I." He stared at me for a few seconds, then nodded. Slowly he turned and walked away, leaving me standing on the porch. For the first time I felt no fear. No guilt. No sadness. Just a quiet sense of victory. I had rebuilt my life. Not from scratch. But from the wreckage he had tried to leave behind. And now finally I was free. 6 months later the house no longer reminded me of him. The walls were a different color now. Warm cream in the living room, soft sage in the kitchen. I'd replaced every piece of furniture they had touched. The floors had been redone, the master bathroom updated, the guest room transformed into a home studio where I worked in the mornings, bathed in light from the east-facing windows. It wasn't a place full of ghosts anymore. It was mine. Completely. The divorce had been finalized 2 months prior. The settlement went through smoothly in the end. Denise had handled the last of it while I took a short trip to the coast. Just me, no plan, no schedule. It was the first time in years I had done something purely for myself. I returned from that trip different. Quieter. Calmer. Certain. I wasn't just recovering anymore. I was building. Word eventually spread. Our old social circle knew what happened, though most didn't ask questions. Those who had taken Mark's side fell away quietly. The others, the ones who knew me before him, the ones who saw through the performance, came back with gentle apologies and open arms. I didn't hold grudges. I didn't need to. I had everything I wanted. And none of it came from him. One afternoon I stood in the backyard under the shade of the old oak tree, watering the small garden I had planted in the spring. Tomatoes, rosemary, lavender, and sunflowers. Everything slow-growing. Everything that needed time and light. Lila stopped by that evening carrying wine and 2 mismatched glasses. "You've turned this place into something beautiful," she said, looking around. "It always had the bones," I replied. "It just needed the right person to take care of it." We sat on the porch watching the sun go down, sipping wine, barefoot, unbothered. There was no more bitterness in me, no more of that sharp ache that used to sting every time I thought about what had been done to me. It was over. The betrayal. The lies. The humiliation. Gone. And in its place, peace, strength, stillness. Later that night, after Lila left, I walked through the house with the lights dimmed. I passed the kitchen where Camille once made her smoothies. The hallway where Mark used to pace during his work calls. The bedroom where I used to lie awake wondering what I had done wrong. Now there was no trace of them. Just the hum of a quiet home. I stepped out onto the back porch again. The night was warm, the garden still fragrant from the sun. I sat down with a journal and wrote 1 sentence at the top of the page. He tried to take everything, but I gave him nothing. Then I closed the book and smiled. Because in the end I didn't just get the house back. I got myself back. And that was worth more than anything he ever had to offer.